Love is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. David Carter had learned this truth the hard way. If someone had told him months ago that the woman he cherished would be the architect of his downfall, he would have laughed in their face. But the universe had a cruel way of unveiling masks, and Aisha's mask had been the most deceptive of all. David was a man who had built his empire from the ground up. He wasn't born into wealth. Every dollar he owned had been earned through sleepless nights, ruthless negotiations, and sacrifices no one but he could understand. But despite his hardened exterior in the business world, there was one place where he had always been soft: his marriage. Aisha was the one thing in his life that made him feel like more than just a machine built for success. Her laugh, her gentle touch, the way she looked at him with admiration. It had been enough to make him believe that for once, he had something money couldn't buy. But love had made him blind. The betrayal didn't happen overnight. No, it was a slow, well-calculated plan. While David worked tirelessly, thinking he was securing a future for them both, Aisha had been securing a future for herself, one that didn't include him. It had started with what should have been a routine business trip. David had flown to London for a high-stakes deal that would secure his company's expansion into Europe. The trip had been promising, and the deal was nearly finalized. But fate had other plans. Late one evening, as he rode back to his hotel, a reckless driver sped through a red light. The world had tilted in an instant. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and a deafening crash rang through the air. His body was hurled against the car's interior, pain ripping through him before darkness consumed his senses. For weeks, he remained unconscious in a hospital bed. His body had suffered broken ribs, a concussion, internal bleeding, but it was his silence that had been the most dangerous thing. With no way to communicate, he was powerless. And that was when Aisha struck. Aisha had played the role of a concerned wife perfectly. She had cried for him, told everyone how devastated she was, how helpless she felt without him. But behind closed doors, she had wasted no time seizing the opportunity. She contacted real estate agents, claiming that with David's medical bills piling up and no certainty of his recovery, she had to make tough decisions. The house, their beautiful, custom-built mansion, was put up for sale at a fraction of its worth. The cars, the investments, everything they had built together was liquidated in a matter of weeks. What no one knew was that Aisha was not grieving. She was celebrating. While David lay in a hospital bed fighting for his life, she was making flight reservations for two, herself and her secret lover, Khalid. They had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect moment. The accident had given them their golden opportunity, and Aisha had taken it without hesitation. By the time David's doctors declared him stable and ready for discharge, his world had already been dismantled piece by piece. David had no idea what awaited him when he stepped out of the hospital. The first thing he noticed when his driver pulled up to the house was the unfamiliar "For Sale" sign hammered into the lawn. A cold, unsettling feeling crept down his spine. "This must be a mistake," he muttered, stepping out of the car. But the real shock awaited him at the doorstep. The grand double doors, which once welcomed him into warmth and security, were wide open. Inside, the house was hollow, gutted of everything that once made it a home. The walls were bare, the floors echoed with emptiness, and the grand chandelier in the foyer was gone. The truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't his house anymore. It had been sold. He staggered back outside, hoping, praying, that this was some misunderstanding. But then, his eyes landed on something that made his blood run cold. His belongings. His suits, his photographs, his personal belongings, his entire life, had been dumped on the sidewalk like trash. His leather briefcase lay open, papers scattered across the pavement, some soaked from the damp evening air. Framed photos of their wedding day, once symbols of love, were now cracked and shattered. And then he saw it, an envelope taped to a small wooden crate. With trembling hands, he tore it open. Inside was a single note, written in the elegant handwriting he had once loved. "David, By the time you read this, I will be long gone. You should have seen this coming. Maybe if you had spent less time building an empire and more time paying attention, you would have realized that I was never yours to keep. Don't bother looking for me. I've already started my new life, with someone who actually knows how to make me happy. Aisha, the words burned into his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. David sank to his knees, the paper crumpled in his fist. He had built a life with her. He had given her everything, and she had repaid him by destroying it all in a matter of weeks. But as he sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of his past, something inside him shifted. The pain, the betrayal, it all hardened into something else. He would find her, and when he did, she would regret ever thinking he was a man she could break. The game had just begun. The night air was thick with silence as David Carter stood before what was once his home. The mansion, his pride and joy, now belonged to someone else, or so the world believed. The walls that had once echoed with laughter, late-night conversations, and whispered promises were nothing more than an empty shell of memories. But Aisha had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated him. David wasn't just some rich businessman who had stumbled into success. He was a strategist, a man who understood that power was not about money alone. It was about control. And while Aisha had played her little game, believing she had won, she had no idea that he had already set his pieces in motion long before she even thought to betray him. As David stood outside the mansion, the rumble of an approaching car pulled him from his thoughts. The sleek black Audi came to a slow stop, and the tinted window rolled down. Behind the wheel was Mark Reynolds, David's most trusted friend and business partner. Mark stepped out, his sharp blue eyes scanning the wreckage of David's belongings on the pavement before resting on him. "Rough night?" Mark said, offering a cigarette. David exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You could say that." Mark lit the cigarette and took a slow drag. "I assume you've put two and two together?" David clenched his jaw. "She sold everything, drained my accounts, left the country with her lover." Mark nodded. "That much I already knew." David narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" A smirk played on Mark's lips as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a set of keys. He tossed them to David, who caught them in confusion. "Your house," Mark said, tilting his head toward the mansion. "It's not gone. I bought it." David's grip tightened around the keys. Mark chuckled. "The moment I saw the house listed, I knew something wasn't right. So, I did what any good friend would do. I bought it under a shell company before anyone else could. It's still yours, David. She didn't take everything." David stared at his friend, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. It was the first glimmer of hope he'd had since waking up in the hospital. But hope wasn't enough. "I don't want the house, Mark," David said quietly, pocketing the keys. "I want revenge." David wasn't the type of man to break down and wallow in self-pity. Aisha may have thought she had left him to drown in sorrow, but what she had really done was awaken something far more dangerous, a hunger for retribution. By the next morning, David had assembled a team of private investigators. Every resource at his disposal was now focused on one goal: tracking Aisha. It didn't take long. Aisha had never been the type to stay in the shadows. She enjoyed the finer things in life: lavish parties, designer brands, extravagant vacations. And now, she was indulging herself freely, believing she had escaped without consequence. The first lead came from an unexpected source: Instagram. David's investigators found pictures of Aisha and Khalid lounging in a private villa in Dubai. The couple was sipping champagne by an infinity pool, the Burj Khalifa towering in the distance. She hadn't even bothered to hide. David stared at the images on his phone, his fingers curling into a fist. "She's spending my money," he muttered. Mark, standing beside him, glanced at the screen and let out a low whistle. "She didn't waste any time, did she?" David's jaw tightened. "No, but neither will I." Aisha was living in a fantasy. She believed herself untouchable, far from the grasp of the man she had betrayed. She and Khalid dined at the finest restaurants, stayed in five-star hotels, and spent money as if it were infinite. They attended exclusive parties, rubbing shoulders with billionaires and socialites, pretending to be royalty among the elite. But what Aisha didn't know was that every step she took, every transaction she made, was being watched. David wasn't just gathering information. He was setting the stage for something far greater. His plan was simple. First, he would drain every penny she had stolen. Every account she had access to would be emptied before she even realized what was happening. Then, when she had nothing left, he would come for her. And by the time she saw him again, she would wish she had never been born. David placed his phone down, his mind already calculating the next steps. "This isn't just about taking back what's mine," he said coldly. "I want her to suffer." Mark studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's get started." As the Dubai skyline glittered under the night sky, Aisha laughed in blissful ignorance, unaware that her perfect escape was nothing more than an illusion. The king had been dethroned, but now he was coming back to reclaim everything. And this time, there would be no mercy. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and David Carter was a patient man. The old David, the one who had loved Aisha with all his heart, who had once believed in loyalty and devotion, was gone. The man who stood in his place was calculating, relentless, and utterly ruthless. Taking immediate action would have been too easy. Aisha had taken everything from him, not just his home and wealth, but his trust. She had left him to die, discarded him like an afterthought. That kind of betrayal deserved something far worse than simple retaliation. She deserved ruin, and David would make sure she suffered every step of the way. From the moment he discovered Aisha's whereabouts in Dubai, David had set his plan in motion. The first step was control. Using his extensive business connections, he infiltrated every financial channel she had access to. It wasn't difficult. Aisha had always been reckless with money, relying on convenience rather than caution. She had no idea how deep David's influence ran in the financial world. One by one, her lifelines were severed. Her bank accounts? Frozen. Her credit cards? Declined. Her investments? Liquidated. Except the money never made it to her hands. The first time she noticed something was wrong was at a luxury boutique in Dubai. She had walked in confidently, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she reached for an emerald green designer dress. The sales associate smiled at her, recognizing her as one of their best customers. But when she handed over her platinum card, the machine beeped. "Declined," the associate said, frowning. Aisha's smile faltered. "That's impossible. Try again." Another beep. "Perhaps you'd like to use a different card, madam?" Aisha, flustered, pulled out another, and another. Each one failed. Her hands began to shake. Khalid, who had been lounging in a chair nearby, barely glanced up from his phone. "What's the problem?" "The bank must be having issues," Aisha muttered, forcing a smile. "I'll sort it out." She left the store humiliated, but the full weight of her situation hadn't hit her yet. That would come later. Aisha's next wake-up call came when she tried to check into her five-star hotel suite, only to be informed that her reservation had been canceled due to a payment failure. She called her bank, only to be placed on hold for over an hour. When she finally got through, the voice on the other end was chillingly formal. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your accounts have been frozen due to suspicious activity." "What?" Aisha's voice rose. "That's impossible. I need access to my funds immediately. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do at this time. You'll need to visit the bank in person with proper identification and documentation." Aisha slammed her phone down, breathing heavily. Something was very wrong, and it only got worse. Her offshore accounts? Emptied. Her investments? Seized due to legal complications. Her assets? Suddenly under investigation for fraud. It was as if the entire world had turned against her overnight. At first, Khalid seemed supportive. "Don't worry, Habibti. It's just a small issue. We'll fix it." But as the days passed and the financial disaster deepened, his patience wore thin. Aisha noticed the shift immediately. The once doting man who had promised her the world began pulling away. He started going out alone, leaving her behind in their now downgraded accommodations. His messages became short, his affection colder. Then, one night, she woke up to find his side of the bed empty. She checked her phone. No messages. Hours passed, and when he finally returned at dawn, he reeked of perfume that wasn't hers. "Khalid," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Where were you?" He shrugged. "Out." "Out where? Does it matter?" He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You're broke, Aisha. The glamorous life? It's over. Maybe it's time you start being realistic." Her heart pounded. "Are you leaving me?" He scoffed. "Leaving what? A woman with no money? No status? No power?" He shook his head. "You're not the Aisha I signed up for." She felt like the ground beneath her had vanished. The man she had risked everything for, the one she had betrayed her husband for, was abandoning her the moment things turned difficult, and she realized, too late, that she had miscalculated everything. David sat in his office, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand as he watched the latest report from his investigators. Aisha was crumbling. She had gone from living in luxury to barely being able to afford a decent hotel. Khalid was distancing himself, no doubt already looking for his next conquest. And she still had no idea who was behind it all. David smirked. It wasn't enough yet. He wanted to see her completely shattered. And the next step? That was when the real fun would begin. The walls were closing in. Aisha had always seen herself as untouchable, a woman who could manipulate men, play the game, and always come out on top. But for the first time in her life, she felt powerless. Her fortune had vanished into thin air. Every time she tried to regain control, something stopped her. Someone was pulling the strings, cutting off her every escape route. And deep down, a sickening realization began to form. This wasn't bad luck. This was punishment. Sitting in the dimly lit hotel room she could barely afford, Aisha frantically scrolled through her phone. She had one last trick up her sleeve. An emergency stash of money hidden in an offshore account, one that even Khalid didn't know about. Her hands trembled as she entered her credentials. A sigh of relief escaped her lips as the balance appeared. Her last safety net, untouched. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over. With swift precision, she initiated a transfer to a different account, one she believed was beyond reach. Transfer processing. Aisha exhaled. Maybe she still had a chance. Then, a new message appeared on the screen. Transfer declined. Account frozen. Her blood ran cold. She tried again. Same result. Frantic, she called the bank, her voice sharp with urgency. "I need to access my funds immediately. There must be a mistake." The representative's voice was polite, but firm. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your account is under investigation for fraudulent activity. You are not authorized to make withdrawals at this time." Aisha's vision blurred with rage. Who authorized this investigation? "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information." The line went dead. Aisha let out a strangled scream, hurling her phone against the wall. Who was doing this to her? And then, like a slow-burning revelation, she knew. David. Aisha had nothing left but Khalid. She had given up everything for him. Surely, he wouldn't abandon her. Would he? She found him at the rooftop bar of an upscale hotel, lounging with a glass of whiskey in hand, his arm draped casually over the shoulders of another woman, a younger, stunning brunette draped in diamonds. The sight made Aisha's stomach turn. She stormed toward him. "Khalid." He barely reacted, only glancing at her with mild annoyance. "Aisha, what are you doing here?" Her eyes blazed. "What am I doing here? Who the hell is she?" The woman smirked, sipping her cocktail as if she were watching a show. Aisha turned to Khalid, voice shaking with fury. "After everything I gave up for you? After everything I lost?" Khalid sighed, setting his drink down. Aisha, let's not be dramatic. Dramatic? She laughed bitterly. I lost my entire life because of you. No, Habibti, Khalid said smoothly. You lost your life because you were stupid enough to think I'd stay once you had nothing left. Aisha recoiled as if she'd been slapped. So that's it, she whispered. You're just done with me? Khalid took a sip of his drink. That's how the game works, darling. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had always thought she was the predator. Now, she realized she had been prey all along. Nowhere left to run, abandoned, humiliated, and broke. Aisha found herself wandering the streets of Dubai, completely alone. Her credit cards were useless. Her name, once respected, was now a stain. She had burned every bridge she ever built. She tried calling old friends. No one answered. She reached out to distant relatives. Every call went ignored. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be truly alone. No money, no power, no Khalid, and no future. As she sat on a cold bench outside a closed cafe, staring blankly at the city lights, her mind drifted to the one person she never thought she'd need. David. She had left him to die. She had laughed at his misfortune, stolen from him, and walked away without looking back. Would he even listen to her? Would he even pick up her call? Swallowing what was left of her pride, Aisha pulled out her phone with shaking hands, and she dialed the number she thought she'd never call again. It rang. Once. Twice. Then, a voice she hadn't heard in months answered. Calm. Cold. Unforgiving. Well, well, David said. Look who finally decided to crawl back. The phone felt heavy in Aisha's trembling hands. She had rehearsed this call in her mind 1,000 times, but now, as she listened to the slow, deliberate breaths on the other end of the line, she felt like a cornered animal. Still, she had no choice. David, she whispered, her voice cracking just enough to sound pitiful. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, but please, I have nowhere else to go. Silence. Then, his voice, calm, measured. Nowhere else to go? He let the words hang in the air. You seem to be doing just fine last time I checked. Aisha forced back the lump in her throat. I wasn't thinking straight. Khalid. He used me. He tricked me into leaving. I was blinded, David. But now I see the truth. David chuckled softly. Do you? Yes, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. I was a fool. I let greed and lies ruin everything we had. But I swear to you, if you let me come back, I'll make it right. I'll do anything. Just please help me. She held her breath, waiting. David sighed. Aisha, after everything you did, why should I trust you? Tears welled in her eyes. Because I love you. The words felt like acid on her tongue, but she forced them out. I realize that now. You were the only man who ever truly cared for me. A long pause. Then, David spoke, his tone softer. You really mean that? With all my heart. Another silence. Then, all right, Aisha. I'll help you. A sob of relief burst from her lips. Oh, David, thank you. Thank you so much. I'll never betray you again, I swear. David smiled. I'll arrange your flight. Pack your things. I'll be waiting. Aisha collapsed onto the hotel bed, clutching the phone to her chest. She had done it. She was going home. Or so she thought. The moment David ended the call, his expression hardened. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. She took the bait, he murmured. Across from him, Mark Reynolds, his closest friend and business partner, chuckled. She actually believes you're taking her back? David nodded. Hook, line, and sinker. He picked up his second phone and dialed a number. It rang once before a voice answered. This is Agent Collins. It's time, David said. There was a pause. Then, understood. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. Aisha thought she was flying home to safety. She had no idea she was walking straight into a trap. Aisha sat in first class, sipping champagne as the plane soared over the ocean. She had nothing left but the hope that David would forgive her. Of course, she would have to play her cards right. She needed to act like the perfect wife, remorseful and grateful. She would win him over, slowly regain his trust. And once she did, she would take back everything. She smirked to herself. David always had a weakness for her. It wouldn't take long before she was back in control. The announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." Aisha exhaled, closing her eyes. She had one. She had no idea what awaited her. As the plane taxied down the runway, Aisha felt excitement bubble in her chest. She had imagined this moment 100 times. David standing at the arrival's gate, his eyes filled with longing and regret, ready to welcome her back. She stepped off the plane, adjusting her dress, plastering the perfect look of gratitude on her face. Then, she saw them. Not David, not Mark, not a single familiar face. Instead, a line of uniformed officers stood at the terminal exit, their expressions cold and unreadable. Confusion flickered in Aisha's mind. That confusion turned to horror when one of the officers stepped forward. "Aisha Carter?" She swallowed hard. "Why, yes. You're under arrest." Aisha's heart stopped. "What?" The officer pulled out a document. "You're being charged with fraud, theft, and identity deception. You have the right to remain silent." Handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Panic surged through her. "No, this has to be a mistake. I don't understand." Then, she saw him. Standing behind the glass window of the airport lounge, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, was David. Their eyes met, and Aisha understood everything. Her knees nearly buckled. "David, David, please," she screamed, struggling against the officers. "You set me up? You lied to me?" David tilted his head, his eyes cold and unreadable. Then, he smirked. Aisha's screams echoed through the airport as she was dragged away, kicking and pleading. She had spent her life playing games, deceiving and betraying those who trusted her. And now, the game had finally turned against her. The cold steel bars of the holding cell pressed against Aisha's back as she sat, arms wrapped around herself. The reality of her situation had not fully sunk in, or maybe it had, and she just refused to accept it. Her mind raced, trying to process what had happened. Just hours ago, she had been sipping champagne in first class, dreaming of reclaiming the life she had once had. And now she was in a filthy cell, stripped of her jewelry, her designer clothes replaced by a drab gray jumpsuit. Her past life was gone, and in its place was the grim, suffocating weight of betrayal. Or was it justice? She clenched her fists. No, she would find a way out. She always did. The next morning, Aisha was escorted to an interrogation room. The air smelled of stale coffee and ink from stacks of paperwork. Across from her sat a man in a suit, his expression blank, his fingers drumming against a thick folder. He opened it slowly, flipping through page after page. "Fraud, embezzlement, grand larceny," he read aloud. His voice was calm, methodical, as if he were listing groceries. "Mrs. Carter, these charges could put you away for 20 years. Aisha swallowed hard. "But," he continued, leaning forward, "if you cooperate, we might be willing to negotiate a lighter sentence." Aisha's heart pounded. This was her chance. If she played this right, she could manipulate her way out. She had done it before. She straightened her posture, forcing herself into the role she knew best, the innocent victim. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "I was manipulated, forced, into doing things I didn't want to do. Khalid, he threatened me. I had no choice." The agent raised an eyebrow. "You had no choice?" "No," Aisha lied smoothly. "I was scared. He controlled everything. If I didn't do what he said, He would have hurt me. She lowered her gaze, feigning distress. I can help you. If I testify against him, will that help my case? She was so sure this would work. But then, the agent chuckled. He chuckled. Aisha's stomach dropped. You really think we don't know what's going on? He asked, flipping another page. You see, Mrs. Carter, your husband, ex-husband, rather, he made sure we had everything before you even stepped foot back in the country. Aisha's breath caught in her throat. The agent turned the file toward her, revealing printed copies of bank statements, money transfers, and real estate documents. Every fraudulent transaction, every offshore account, every stolen asset, all traced back to her. And then, a transcript of her phone call with David. Her own words, pleading, lying, trying to deceive him yet again. Aisha's hands shook as she pushed the folder away. This isn't right. I was set up. The agent only smiled. You're not getting out of this one, Mrs. Carter. David made sure of it. Aisha sat in stunned silence as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had lost. There was no way out. And then came the final blow. The agent leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Oh, and by the way, Khalid has been arrested too. Aisha's head snapped up. What? She whispered. He was picked up in Morocco early this morning, the agent said. Seems your little partner in crime wasn't as clever as he thought. Tax fraud, money laundering, identity theft. David had all the right people looking into him. Aisha's mouth went dry. No money, no allies, no way out. She was completely alone. Her mind spun. Maybe Khalid would cut a deal. Maybe he would take the fall for everything. Maybe she still had a chance. But the agent smirked as if reading her thoughts. Funny thing, he said, flipping another page. The moment we put Khalid in cuffs, he started talking. Blamed you for everything. Said it was your idea, your plan, your deception. Gave us names, dates, evidence. Aisha's vision blurred. Khalid betrayed her, just like she had betrayed David. She let out a hollow, broken laugh. So this is what it feels like, she murmured. The agent closed the folder. Enjoy your stay in prison, Mrs. Carter. The guards came for her, gripping her arms as they led her away. For the first time in her life, there was no way to lie, cheat, or seduce her way out. For the first time, she understood true powerlessness, and she had only herself to blame. David Carter stood in front of his office window, overlooking the bustling city below. His empire, built from years of hard work, was now more solid than ever. He had come a long way from the man who had been betrayed in the most cruel and unexpected way. But as he watched the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, he didn't feel the sting of bitterness. He didn't feel the need to gloat. In fact, there was only one thought that lingered in his mind: justice. He hadn't sought revenge, at least, not in the way the world might have seen it. His actions weren't fueled by anger. They had been driven by clarity, by a desire to restore balance. What Aisha had done to him, what she had stolen from him, it had to be stopped, and David had made sure it was. As the weeks passed, David found solace in his work. The board meetings, the negotiations, the corporate strategy, all of it was easier to manage now that the weight of Aisha's betrayal was no longer hanging over him. He had transformed that pain into fuel. He had learned a hard lesson: never trust blindly. People would disappoint you, betray you, and show you their true selves when you least expect it. But those lessons, as difficult as they were, had made him stronger, more focused. David had become a different man. The shattered, betrayed man who had once been broken by love now stood as a symbol of resilience and success. The CEO, not just of his company, but of his own life. And though he never allowed himself to dwell on the past, he couldn't help but think of Aisha now and then. The woman who had once been the love of his life. The woman who had taken everything, only to lose it all in the blink of an eye. In a prison cell on the other side of the world, Aisha sat on the edge of her cot, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above her. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear. No, it was something else. Regret. She had betrayed the one man who had trusted her. And now, she had nothing. No money. No lover. No future. The cold, gray walls of the prison had become her only reality. Her days were spent staring at the walls, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. How had she fallen so far? And then one afternoon, as she sat in the common area, a guard came to fetch her. He held a small television under his arm, and a strange sense of curiosity filled Aisha as he handed it to her. On the screen, she saw a familiar face. David. But he wasn't the man she had left behind. No, this was a man transformed. A powerful, charismatic leader. Respected, admired, and in control. CEO of Carter Enterprises. The words flashed across the screen, and Aisha's stomach churned. Her mind raced. She had never imagined David would rise to such heights. She had always seen him as a mere means to an end, a stepping stone to her success. And now, he was the one everyone admired. He was the one who had won. The same man she had discarded had become everything she would never be. As Aisha stared at the screen, her face pale and her eyes wide, she felt a sharp, unmistakable pang of regret. It wasn't the kind of regret that could be easily erased with tears or promises. It was a deep, gnawing ache in her chest that reminded her of what she had lost. Trust, love, power. She had gambled everything, and in the end, it was her own downfall. David had given her the chance to return, to make amends, but her pride and greed had sealed her fate. She had underestimated him, thinking that his love for her would be enough to blind him. But David had seen through her. He had outsmarted her at every turn, and now she was paying the price. From the confines of her prison cell, Aisha couldn't escape the truth. She had made one fatal mistake. She had betrayed the wrong man. But in the back of her mind, a final, bitter thought lingered. Betrayal may break a man, but it also has the power to make him invincible. David had been broken, but now he was invincible. David's empire continued to grow, his reputation soaring. He had reclaimed his throne, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And as the world continued to turn, David never looked back. He had made his peace with the past. He had learned, he had rebuilt, and now nothing could touch him. He was the king of his own destiny. And Aisha? She was nothing more than a distant memory, a footnote in his journey. If you enjoyed the twists, turns, and ultimate triumph of David's story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more thrilling tales of betrayal, redemption, and justice. Share your thoughts below. What would you have done in David's shoes? Until next time, stay strong and never underestimate the power of resilience. See you soon.